alleged coaxing of Yemeni President Saleh, a longtime ally of Saddam Hussein, who has been known as Little Saddam himself. Though it is perplexing policy when coupled with repeated official statements against the Baathists, it is hardly surprising that the U.S. has once again gone down this road, having eagerly allied with Saddam's Baathist regime before eventually declaring it an enemy and invading. Whether the Saleh government will share the Saddam government's fate remains to be seen. And now we have an article from Courthouse News on January the 8th, written by Avery Fellow. Gitmo confession tainted by torture, judge says. A federal judge in Washington, D.C. ordered the release of a Yemeni detainee, saying that the government's case to keep him at Guantanamo relies too heavily on confessions tainted by torture. U.S. District Judge Ricardo Urbina ruled that Saeed Mohammed Saleh Hatim's confession that he was part of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was unreliable because it was allegedly obtained under torture in Afghanistan. Hatim was captured in Pakistan in November of 2001 and was held for 6 months in Kandahar, Afghanistan, where he was allegedly beaten and threatened with rape. The government's allegations rest almost entirely upon admission made by the petitioner himself, admissions that the petitioner contends he made only because he had previously been tortured while in U.S. custody, Urbina wrote. The government claimed that Hatim trained at the Al-Farouk terrorist camp, stayed at Al-Qaeda safe houses, and fought against U.S. and coalition forces at the Battle of Tora Bora in Afghanistan in December of 2001. The government faces a steep uphill climb in attempting to persuade the court that the petitioner's detention is justified based on the allegation that he trained at Al-Farouk, given that the sole evidence offered in support of that allegation is tainted by torture. Hatim never admitted to fighting against the U.S. and allied forces, and there is no evidence that he was part of Al-Qaeda when he stayed at the guest houses, the judge found. Hatim has been detained at Guantanamo Bay since June of 2002. Now, off the heels of that story, we have one from the AP on January 6th, written by Mark Sherman. Appeals court ruling limits Guantanamo detainees' rights and gives the president wide detention power. A federal appeals court ruling Tuesday could make it harder for Guantanamo detainees to challenge their confinement and endorsed the government's broad power to hold people seized in the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. A three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit upheld the continued detention of a former cook for Taliban forces who said he never fired a shot in battle. Ghalib Nasser al-Bihani, a citizen of Yemen who was captured in Afghanistan, has been held at the U.S. Naval Base in Cuba since 2002. The court was unanimous in rejecting al-Bihani's appeal, but two judges appointed by President George W. Bush took a broader view of the detention power than the Obama administration had argued for in the case. Tuesday's decision can be appealed either to the full appeals court or the Supreme Court. Al-Bihani's lawyers did not immediately comment on the ruling. If it stands, the ruling will apply to every other detainee case filed in Washington and could give the government a strong basis to challenge an order to release a detainee. Also from the AP, we have an article from January the 9th, written by Richard Lardner. Z, otherwise known as Blackwater, services aiming for Afghan police training deal. Blackwater Worldwide's legal woes haven't dimmed the company's prospects in Afghanistan, where it's a contender to be a key part of President Barack Obama's strategy for stabilizing the country. Now called Z Services, the company is in the running for a Pentagon contract potentially worth $1 billion to train Afghanistan's troubled national police force. Z has been shifting to training aviation and logistics work after its security guards were accused of killing unarmed Iraqi civilians more than 2 years ago. A federal judge on New Year's Eve dismissed criminal charges against 5 of the Blackwater guards, citing repeated missteps by federal prosecutors. The Iraqi government has vowed to pursue the case. A new strain on relations between the U.S. and Iraq, Z, on Wednesday reached a settlement in a series of civil lawsuits in which dozens of Iraqis accused the company of cultivating a reckless culture that allowed innocent civilians to be killed. On Thursday, however, 2 former Blackwater contractors were arrested on murder charges in the shootings of 2 Afghans after a traffic accident last year. Now, moving on to economic news, we have an article written by myself on January the 8th. AIG emails spark anger at Geithner from both sides of the political paradigm. Nearly a year after his appointment as U.S. Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner finds himself catching the ire of both sides of the left-right paradigm this week after some internal emails came out showing that apparently while Geithner was in charge of the New York Fed, he pushed AIG to keep secret from the public certain terms of the company's bailout. The government agreed to pay banks 100 cents on the dollar for their contracts with AIG, even though the company was trying to bargain down the price. This assured that the company could get back all of its bad investment with the U.S. public footing the bill, paying with money borrowed from other countries and the printing of devalued currency. This revelation gives the term bailout a new meaning as the reality of the elite's unapologetic corruption is becoming more apparent to an ever more outraged American public, the majority of which was against the bailout's drastic display of corporate socialism last fall already. Calls for Geithner's resignation are loud among his critics as the question of who our public servants, him among others, are really representing is being answered. And then along with that, we have an article from Raw Story. This is on January the 8th by Daniel Tenser. Lawsuit. Goldman Sachs bonuses bigger than its earnings. A lawsuit filed against investment bank Goldman Sachs by a shareholder alleges that the company spent more money on corporate bonuses than it earned in 2008. Shareholder Ken Brown's lawsuit and one of two suits filed against the company this week over its controversial decision to hand out billions of dollars in bonuses even after it was accused of playing a central role in the financial collapse of 2008 and receiving $10 billion in direct aid from the U.S. government. In his lawsuit, Brown states that Goldman Sachs gave out $4.82 billion in bonuses in 2008, despite earnings of only $2.32 billion that year. The lawsuit alleges that the company spent 259% of its income in the first quarter of 2009 on compensation. Are getting rich. We have this article from Providence Business News, written January 8th by Ted Nezzi. 85,000 more jobs lost in December of 2009. The U.S. economy unexpectedly lost 85,000 jobs in December, dashing hopes that the tide has turned on the employment front, the U.S. Labor Department said Friday. The unemployment rate remained at 10%, unchanged from November and down from 10.2% in October. The steady unemployment rate, despite job losses, means more workers have given up looking for a job and thus been dropped from the government's count. The number of jobs lost last month was significantly higher than had been expected. Among 76 economists surveyed by Bloomberg, the median projection was that payrolls were unchanged in December. They also predicted the jobless rate would stay at 10%. Now, on Campaign for Liberty's webpage, January 5th, we have this piece written by Ron Paul. The full text is available online. I'm just going to read some excerpts from it. It's titled, Keynesianism Delivers a Decade of Zero. This past week, we celebrated the end of what most people agree was a decade best forgotten. New York Times columnist and leading Keynesian economist Paul Krugman called it the Big Zero in a recent column. He wrote that, quote, there was a whole lot of nothing going on in measures of economic progress or success, which is true. However, Krugman continues to misleadingly blame the free market and supposed lack of regulation for the economic chaos. Policymakers would have been wise to heed the warnings of the Austrian economists and must start listening to their teachings if they want solid progress in the future. If not, the necessary correction is going to take a very long time. The Austrian free market economists use common sense principles. You cannot spend your way out of a recession. You cannot regulate the economy into oblivion and expect it to function. You cannot tax people and businesses to the point of near slavery and expect them to keep producing. You cannot create an abundance of money out of thin air without making all that paper worthless. The government cannot make up for rising unemployment by just hiring all the out-of-work people to be bureaucrats or send them unemployment checks forever. You cannot live beyond your means indefinitely. The economy must actually produce something others are willing to buy. Government growth is the opposite of all these things. Bureaucrats are loath to face these unpleasant but obvious realities. It is much more appealing to wave their magic wand of regulation and public spending and to divert blame elsewhere. It is time to be honest about our problems. The tragic reality is that this fatally flawed but widely accepted economic school of thought called Keynesianism has made our country more socialist than capitalist. While the private sector in the last 10 years has experienced a roller coaster of booms and busts and ended up nominally about where we started in 2000, the government has been steadily growing because Keynesians told politicians they could get away with a tax, spend, and inflate policy. They even encouraged it. But we cannot survive much longer if government is our only growth industry. Now moving on